The great hall of Moonstone Palace smelled of ozone and ancient secrets, a sharp contrast to the acrid smoke of the exile ritual that had choked Laura 5 years ago. Then, she had been a branded outcast, chased into the human slums with nothing but the barren curse ringing in her ears. Today, the rhythmic click of her boots against the checkered marble was the only sound in a room filled with the most powerful alphas in the 7 territories. Laura didn't look like a beggar or a ghost. Clad in a flowing cerulean gown that pooled around her feet like moonlight on water, she moved with a quiet, lethal grace. In her arms, she cradled Jose and Jesse. The twin boys were eerily calm, their small tufts of blonde hair glowing under the light of the high, arched windows. As she reached the center of the hall, the music died a sudden, jagged death. King Joseph Blackstone stood frozen atop the dais, his golden ceremonial armor reflecting the flickering torches that lined the stone pillars. He was a man of iron and war, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy fur-lined cape. But as his eyes fell upon the woman in blue, his regal composure shattered. The air grew heavy, thick with the intoxicating scent of a brewing storm. Joseph descended the stairs, his hand hovering instinctively near the hilt of his sword, his gaze locked onto the 2 infants. The visual parallel was a strike to the heart of every noble present. The intricate, sun-etched patterns on the king's breastplate were mirrored perfectly in the wide, amber depths of the twins' eyes. They carried the unmistakable golden eye trait of the royal lineage, a mark that could not be faked. "You were dead," Joseph rasped, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Laura's chest. "I was exiled," Laura corrected, her voice steady despite the deep-seated fear clawing at her throat. She tightened her hold on her sons, her blonde braid catching the firelight as she tilted her chin upward. "The pack called me Barren, and you let them cast me out. But the moon has a way of revealing what is hidden in the dark." Before the king could reach her, the palace guards leveled their spears, the steel tips gleaming. Laura didn't flinch. She had returned to claim a birthright, and as Joseph looked from her to the boys who bore his face, the silence of the court screamed with the realization that the Barren Omega had brought the king's only heirs home. Joseph's hand trembled, the gauntlet of his golden armor clashing against the hilt of his sword with a sound like a death knell. He stepped closer, the primal scent of earth and pine, his signature alpha pheromones, filling the space between them until Laura could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He didn't look at Laura. His amber eyes were fixed with a terrifying intensity on the 2 infants. As he leaned in, his pupils dilated, catching the exact flecks of gold in Jesse's gaze that had been passed down through the Blackstone line for 1,000 years. "No one knew," a council member whispered, the words carrying through the hushed hall. "She was cursed. Barren." Laura felt a shudder pass through Joseph's body. His eyes flickered, a sudden spasm of pain crossing his features as if a physical wall were being hammered inside his mind. The suppressed memories of their forbidden night, the night he was told never happened, began to leak through the cracks of his mental conditioning like blood through a bandage. He reached out a gloved finger, hesitating just inches from Jose's cheek. "Their names," Joseph demanded, his voice no longer a king's command but a broken plea. "Jose and Jesse," Laura replied, her voice ringing with a strength that made the high-ranking alphas in the room flinch. She watched as the realization settled into his bones, the visual proof of his sons stripping away his regal mask. The court erupted into a chaotic murmur as the king's fiancée, Lady Victoria, stepped forward, her face a mask of porcelain fury. "This is a trick! A Barren Omega cannot produce heirs!" But Joseph was deaf to the protest. He looked at Laura, really looked at her for the first time since her exile, and the golden light of the afternoon sun hitting his armor seemed to ignite a matching fire in his eyes. The bond, thoughts severed by the healers and the ritual thrummed back to life, a low-frequency vibration that only they could feel. "They are mine," Joseph whispered, the declaration silencing the room more effectively than any shout. "And you are the mate I was told I imagined." The heavy iron doors of the palace's lower levels groaned shut, sealing Laura and the twins away from the chaos of the grand hall. Though the room was called an interrogation chamber, the velvet-lined chairs and warm hearth suggested a dungeon of truth reserved for highborn prisoners. Laura sat rigidly, her arms still protective loops around Jose and Jesse, while King Joseph stood by the fire, his golden armor cast in flickering orange shadows. The memories he had been told were hallucinations were now flooding back, clashing violently against the lies he had lived. "Tell me everything," Joseph commanded, though his eyes remained soft as they traced the rhythmic rise and fall of his sons' chests. "How did a woman declared barren by the high priestess carry my blood to the human slums?" Laura's gaze was like flint. She described the agonizing months following her exile, hiding her growing belly under oversized coats while working double shifts in human laundries. She spoke of the damp basement where the twins were born, their first cries muffled by the sound of city rain to keep the pack's trackers from finding them. "I didn't return for your crown, Joseph," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of 5 years of silence. "I returned because their magic is growing. They were starting to shift in a world that would call them monsters." Joseph's jaw tightened as the pieces of the conspiracy began to align. He realized his own mother and the council had played on his duty to the throne, using a magical suppressant to mask Laura's fertility and then binding his memories to ensure he wouldn't follow her. The Dungeon of Truth lived up to its name. Every word Laura spoke tore down the facade of his reign. Just as Joseph reached out to take Jose from her, a sudden frantic pounding echoed against the door. A guard's voice, tight with panic, broke the intimacy of the room. "Your Majesty!" "The council is demanding the children be moved to the temple for cleansing. They say the Omegas are rioting at the gates." Laura stood, her fear for herself finally dying to make room for the protector she had become. The sanctuary was over. The political war for her sons' lives had officially begun. The orange glow of the hearth fire was suddenly eclipsed by a shadow moving across the chamber's high window. Before Joseph could react to the guard's warning, the heavy glass shattered inward, showering the velvet carpet in a rain of crystal shards. A hooded figure, cloaked in the dark gray of a professional mercenary, vaulted through the opening with a silver blade already drawn, aimed directly at the bundle in Laura's arms. Laura didn't scream. She acted on the raw, honed instinct of a mother who had survived the slums. She spun away, shielding the twins with her own body as she kicked a heavy oak side table into the assassin's path. Joseph was a blur of golden light and steel. He moved with a speed that defied his heavy ceremonial armor, his sword clearing its scabbard with a lethal hiss. He intercepted the mercenary mid-air, the sound of clashing metal ringing through the stone chamber like a thunderclap. "Guard the door!" Joseph roared, his alpha aura exploding outward in a wave of crushing pressure that made the stone walls seem to tremble. The assassin was skilled, twisting like a serpent to avoid the king's heavy strikes, but Joseph fought with a terrifying, newfound desperation. This wasn't just a king defending his palace. It was a father defending his blood. The mercenary managed a desperate swipe, the silver blade whistling inches from Joseph's neck. But the king didn't flinch. He parried the strike and delivered a punishing blow with his armored gauntlet, sending the intruder reeling back against the cold stone hearth. Before the assassin could recover, Joseph's sword was at his throat. Laura stood in the corner, her chest heaving, her eyes wide as she clutched the twins who had finally begun to wail in terror. In the chaos, the bond between the four of them hummed with a frantic, protective energy. Joseph turned his head slightly, his amber eyes glowing with a feral light as he looked at his crying sons. For the first time, He felt the sharp physical ache of the father-son bond, a tether of blood and magic that demanded he destroy anyone who dared to threaten them. The realization was a secondary blow to his heart. He had almost lost a family he had only just found. The golden flicker of the hearth fire in the interrogation room faded, replaced in Joseph's mind by the silver radiance of a moon 5 years past. The memory, once a blurred smudge of grief and confusion, suddenly snapped into sharp, agonizing focus. It was the night of the great equinox, a celebration where the lines between ranks were supposed to blur, yet the divide between a royal alpha and a barren omega remained a chasm. Joseph saw himself slipping away from the suffocating formalites of the court, seeking the quiet of the willow gardens. There, he had found Laura. She hadn't been wearing cerulean silk then, but a simple linen shift that caught the moonlight, her blonde hair loose and smelling of wild jasmine. The attraction had been instantaneous and primal, a fated pull that ignored the council's decrees and the high priestess's warnings. They had spoken for hours, sharing dreams that had no place in a world governed by bloodlines. When he had finally pulled her into the shadows of the ancient trees, the world had fallen away. It wasn't just a physical encounter, it was a soul binding. He remembered the heat of her skin, the way her amber eyes, the same eyes now blinking at him from the twins' faces, had searched his own for a promise of protection. He had promised her everything that night, unaware that by dawn, the conspiracy would begin its work. By morning, the dungeon of truth had been a different kind of prison. He recalled the cold, medicinal scent of the tea his mother had insisted he drink to settle his nerves. He remembered the high priestess chanting over him, her words weaving a shroud over that night until it felt like nothing more than a fever dream. They had told him he had been alone, that his omega obsession was a hallucination caused by exhaustion. The flashback recoiled as Jesse let out a soft whimper in the present. Joseph looked at Laura, his heart breaking as he realized that while he had been living a lie of comfort, she had been living the brutal reality of his broken promise. The night wasn't forbidden because of their ranks. It was forbidden because the council knew that one night with the Lunar Omega would give Joseph a power they could never control. A family built on truth. The heavy oak doors of the royal council chamber swung open, revealing the stone-faced elders of the 7 territories gathered in a cold, imposing semicircle. Joseph stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword while Laura remained a few paces behind him, her arms tightening around the twins as the elders' judgmental gazes swept over her. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the bitter musk of agitated alphas who refused to believe their carefully constructed world was crumbling. Elder Brennan, the most senior of the council, rose to his feet, his voice like the grinding of ancient stones. "The boy's eyes may bear a resemblance, Your Majesty, but the law of the bloodline is absolute. A woman declared barren by the high priestess cannot suddenly present the crown with heirs. We demand the trial of blood." Laura felt a chill run down her spine as the room erupted in murmurs of agreement. The trial of blood was a brutal, ancient ritual, an archaic test of lineage where the children's blood would be dropped into the great basin of the sun. If the water turned golden, the boys were royal. If it turned black, they would be executed as pretenders. It was a gamble that the council, led by Joseph's mother and the bitter Lady Victoria, was certain they would win. "I will not have my sons bled for your skepticism," Joseph roared, his alpha aura flaring so brightly that the torches in the room flickered and dimmed under the pressure of his power. His protective instincts were at a breaking point, the newfound bond with Jesse and Jose pulsing in his veins like a live wire. "If they are truly your blood, you have nothing to fear," the high priestess interjected, her eyes narrowed and cold as she stepped out from the shadows of the pillars. "Unless, of course, the Barren Omega has used human trickery to mask their true origin. Laura stepped forward, her blonde hair catching the harsh light of the council room as she met the High Priestess's gaze with a ferocity that made the older woman recoil. "I am not afraid of the truth," Laura whispered, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "I am only afraid of the lengths you will go to hide it." With the council's decree finalized, the date for the trial was set, leaving Joseph and Laura with only hours to prepare for a showdown that would either cement their family's future or destroy it forever. The atmosphere in the Temple of the Sun was suffocating, the air thick with the cloying sweetness of ceremonial incense that failed to mask the metallic tang of fear. At the center of the temple stood the Great Basin, its ancient stone rim carved with the history of the Blackstone dynasty. The High Priestess approached with a silver ceremonial dagger, her hands steady, though her eyes betrayed a predatory gleam. Laura watched from the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs, sensing a foulness in the air that no one else seemed to notice. As a healer, her senses were tuned to the vibration of life, and the liquid inside the basin felt dead, tainted by a dark, viscous energy hidden beneath the surface. Joseph stood as a wall of gold between the council and his family, his eyes never leaving the priestess's movements. When she reached for Jose, intending to draw the first drop of blood, Laura's instinct screamed. She saw the glint of a secondary vial hidden in the priestess's sleeve, a drop of obsidian liquid designed to turn the water black regardless of the boy's lineage. "Stop!" Laura's voice didn't just ring. It boomed, vibrating the very foundations of the temple. Before the guards could restrain her, Laura's dormant Omega power, suppressed for years by the council's lies, tore through its cage. A shockwave of pure, lunar silver light erupted from her, throwing the High Priestess back against the stone pillars and shattering the hidden vial in her hand. The black poison hissed as it hit the floor, revealing the sabotage to the gasping nobles. Laura's blonde hair billowed as if caught in a gale, her eyes glowing with a brilliance that rivaled the sun. The silver light didn't fade. It flowed toward the basin, purifying the water before a single drop of the twins' blood had even fallen. Laura realized then that her curse had never been barrenness, but a power so immense it had been feared by the throne itself. She reached out, her hand glowing with celestial energy, and as she touched the basin, the water didn't just turn gold. It ignited into a pillar of divine flame, confirming not only the twins' birthright but her own status as the long-lost Lunar Queen. The poisoned chalice of the council had been overturned, and for the first time the High Priestess looked not at an Omega, but at her undoing. The pillars of the Temple of the Sun groaned as the divine flame from the basin cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, illuminating the terrified faces of the council. Joseph stepped into the center of the blinding radiance, his golden armor shimmering as if it were being forged anew in the heat of the truth. He looked at the High Priestess, who lay crumpled against the stone, and then at his mother, the Dowager Queen, whose face had turned a ghostly, ashen gray as her years of manipulation were incinerated in a single moment. "Enough!" Joseph's voice was a low, terrifying roar that commanded the very air to go still. He reached out and took Laura's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers as the silver light of her power mingled with the golden aura of his own. The physical connection sent a jolt through the temple, a visible bond of fated mates that silenced every whisper of barren or outcast forever. Joseph turned to face the gathered nobility, pulling Laura and the twins into the circle of his protection. "You demanded a trial, and the heavens have answered," he declared, his amber eyes burning with a ferocity that brooked no further challenge. "Laura is not merely the mother of my heirs. She is my fated queen, and Jose and Jesse are the future of this realm. Any word spoken against them from this breath forward is an act of high treason against the crown." The Dowager Queen stepped forward, her voice trembling with a final desperate attempt at control. but Joseph silenced her with a single cold glance. He knelt before Laura in front of the entire court, a king bowing to the woman he had once let slip away, and pressed a reverent kiss to the brows of his sons. The golden light of the Blackstone lineage and the silver magic of the Lunar Omega fused into a singular blinding light, announcing to the 7 territories that the era of lies had ended and a new dynasty had begun. The golden light of the temple had not yet faded when the royal guards, acting on Joseph's silent nod, seized the high priestess and the Dowager Queen's most loyal conspirators. The unmasking was swift and brutal. Under the weight of Joseph's crushing alpha presence and the residual silver glow of Laura's lunar magic, the priestess's resolve shattered. She confessed to the years of systemic suppression, revealing a hidden vault of ledgers that detailed how dozens of Omegas had been falsely branded Barren to maintain a rigid, controllable hierarchy within the territories. Laura stood beside the throne, no longer a victim of these laws but their greatest threat. As the conspirators were marched toward the palace dungeons, she looked out at the gathered Omegas who had begun to congregate at the temple's periphery, their faces a mixture of disbelief and burgeoning hope. She didn't wait for a formal coronation to act. With the twins resting in a silken bassinet at the foot of the dais, Laura spoke her first decree as the recognized Lunar Queen. She demanded the immediate release of all Omegas currently held in fertility clinics, and the destruction of the herbal suppressants that had stolen her youth and Joseph's memories. Joseph watched her with a mixture of awe and fierce pride. He realized then that Laura hadn't just returned to reclaim her son's birthright. She had returned to tear down the very foundations of a corrupt system. The political landscape of the 7 territories was shifting in real time. By the time the sun began to set, the high priestess was stripped of her titles and a new law was drafted, the Law of the Lunar Light, which guaranteed that no Omega would ever again be defined or discarded by a council of alphas. The fall of the priestess was not just the end of a villain, but the beginning of a reformation that would ensure Jose and Jesse inherited a kingdom built on justice rather than shadows. The morning of the royal coronation dawned not with the heavy, suffocating scent of burning sage, but with the crisp, clean aroma of mountain air and wild jasmine. The grand hall, once a theater of Laura's humiliation, had been transformed into a cathedral of light. Thousands of citizens from all designations, alphas, betas, and omegas, crowded the palace grounds, their voices rising in a unified roar that shook the very foundations of the 7 territories. They were no longer gathered to witness a rejection, but to celebrate a restoration. Laura stood before the great mirror, her reflection a testament to the journey from exile to sovereignty. She wore a gown of woven silver and gold, the colors of the lunar and alpha lines finely entwined. Her blonde hair flowed down her back in intricate, bejeweled braids, and the deep-seated fear that had once defined her was gone, replaced by the calm, unwavering power of a queen who knew her worth. Beside her, Jose and Jesse were dressed in miniature royal tunics, their amber eyes wide with wonder as they reached for the silver moon pendants hanging from their mother's neck. As she entered the hall, the music was a triumphant swell of drums and horns. King Joseph awaited her at the foot of the dais, no longer a solitary ruler, but a man made whole. He wore the golden armor of the Blackstone line, but his helm was off, revealing a face softened by the joy of a father and the devotion of a mate. He reached out, his hands steady and warm, and led Laura up the steps to the twin thrones that now sat side by side. The archbishop stepped forward, but it was Joseph who took the crowns. He placed the silver tiara upon Laura's head first, his voice echoing with a promise that would outlast the stone of the palace. "I crown you my queen, my fated mate, and the mother of the future." Then he turned to the infants, touching their brows with a thumb traced in royal oils. "And I name you the princes of the realms." The coronation was not just a ceremony. It was the final seal on a prophecy of peace. As Joseph and Laura turned to face their people, the silver light of the Lunar Queen and the golden ore of the Alpha King fused into a singular blinding radiance that spilled out of the palace and over the horizon. The Barren Omega had returned, and in her wake, she had brought not just heirs, but a new world where every soul was recognized by their light, and no one would ever be lost in the shadows again.